Welcome everyone to this latest edition of the ORF series Neighborhood Scope. Today we're going to be discussing Afghanistan 3 years after the Taliban takeover, which which came as a bit of a bolt from the blue, at least for people who were overestimating what could happen in Kabul and the fight that awaited the Taliban. That never happened. But of course, the Americans had led us to believe that uh, things will be stable for some time, which clearly they were not. And here we are 3 years later. The Taliban seem to be firmly ensconced, but we have a great panel to tell us whether indeed they are firmly in power or there are any reasons to believe that there could be challenges to them. We have a great panel with us today. We have Ambassador Jayant Prasad. He's the former Indian ambassador to Kabul, has held many other positions in the Indian Foreign Office, and is an academically inclined diplomat. Not many of them, but he is one of the few. And he has also been the Director General of the IDSA. We have Dr. Amira Jadoon, who is probably the go-to person if you want to learn about terrorism in the region, in the AFPAC region. Her work on the ISKP is probably the finest, and her book, which is apparently now coming out in paperback, because the hard copy, the hardbound version was so expensive that one couldn't dream of buying it. Hopefully, the paperback should be simpler to buy. So we're looking forward to that book. But she is probably one of the foremost experts on terrorism in the region. We have Sadiq Amini, who has been associated with the ORF. He is an Afghan, and we cannot talk about Afghanistan without having an Afghan. Um, and he is a public policy, public diplomacy, and international security expert. Uh, and last but not the least, we have my colleague Shivam Shekhawat, who's a junior fellow at ORF, and who actually deserves the credit for putting together today's show. And many thanks to everybody who's attending it in person. It's rainy days in Delhi, and civic infrastructure being what it is. You really got to be interested in Afghanistan to be present, coming in through the braving the rains to be present out here today. So thank you all. You all. Let me start with Sadiq. Sadiq, 3 years into the Taliban regime, uh, are they consolidating? Are they shaky? Uh, is the movement coherent? Are there strains uh, which could develop into cleavages? What exactly is the situation in Afghanistan today? How firmly is the Taliban in power, or are they not? Sadiq.
Namaste, everybody. Glad to be here and among esteemed colleagues, ambassador, and all the participants. Thank you, ORF, for facilitating this important and timely discussion. As you rightly indicated, the collapse of Afghanistan's Islamic Republic came as a surprise to the international community, United States, India, major powers, but not to the countries who are sponsoring the Taliban, who are actively sure that the Taliban take full power in Afghanistan and make sure there is zero presence of the US and coalition forces in Afghanistan, or the presence of countries like India. And so they were able to successfully achieve what they were setting their eyes on, and they achieved it. Since August 2021, we have been seeing how these countries, led by China, have actively been trying to promote the Taliban as a stable, as a responsible, or some sort of a legitimate government. If not legitimate, a government that does not have any replacement. They've been trying to achieve that objective by supporting the Taliban financially, supporting the Taliban through their advisors that are embedded in different entities, especially in the security sector, as well as diplomatically at the regional and international forums. They've also been trying to make sure there's no split between various Taliban factions. They have been mediating from time to time, along with their ISI counterparts, to make sure there's no problem between the Taliban. And also, they have actively been trying to restrict the regional environment as well as international environment to prevent any major resistance against the Taliban. From the early days, the Afghan people, ready to rally around any leader that could stand against the Taliban. But unfortunately, the Afghan leadership failed to rise up to the challenge. Some of them escaped the country, some of them escaped the capital. And so the Afghan people were left on their own. And without a proper leadership and organizational structure, they were unable to formulate a coherent resistance. There was pockets of resistance here and there in different provinces, and majorly in Panjshir province. And eventually that one was also crushed with the support and active participation by the Pakistani military in support of the Taliban. And so the resistance, the pockets of resistance, they moved into Tajikistan. That's the only country in the neighborhood right now that is tolerating any sort of presence by anti-Taliban groups. And within the country, the women from the first days of the Taliban, they came out on the streets to protest, not just in Kabul, but also in Herat and different provinces, to indicate that more than 50% of the population, which is the Afghan women, they are against the Taliban, and they do not respect this. They do not accept this. They consider the Taliban to be an illegitimate government in their eyes. And we saw how the Taliban reacted with beating them and slapping them and arresting them and all the heinous crimes that are being committed against Afghan women in the Taliban jails. Unfortunately, there are several reports of rapes and recorded gang rapes and assassinations and killings, extrajudicial killings of the Afghan women, Afghan civil society representatives, or anybody who could raise their voices against the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so the voices of dissent, the voices of criticism, the space for disagreement against the Taliban is significantly shrinked. And so there is a unity of purpose among all factions and all the groups of Taliban to crush any voices, any groups, any movement that would stand up against the Taliban and their narrative. They have turned the country into an Islamic state, a breeding ground for terrorism, where they have facilitated and they have hosted all of the terrorist groups and terrorist organizations that have been linked with them in their earlier regime, but also during the past 20 years, more than 20 years, when they were fighting against the coalition and NATO forces and Afghan National Defense and Security Forces and the Afghan people. All of those terrorist organizations which were facilitating suicide attacks and complex attacks. They are right now in Kabul. We saw the first instances when Zawahiri was being identified and spotted in Kabul, despite the fact that they had agreed with the U.S. that they would cut off their connections and relationship with Al-Qaeda. Al-Zawahiri was identified. The Taliban did not take any action, and so the U.S. intelligence, they went unilaterally to take him out. And similarly, we have seen since 2021, the U.S. and coalition forces relying upon their over-the-horizon capabilities that is being conducted from the neighborhood. They have gone after the Taliban, after terrorist organizations and terrorist groups and terrorist networks in different parts of the country whenever they have noticed that they have become a potential threat. But there is a limit to how much they can do through the over-the-horizon capabilities without having on-the-ground human personnel and the networks and the needed relationships to identify these networks, because these networks are not operating on digital platforms. They're not. They are relying upon the traditional ancient mechanisms of hawala systems and verbal communication, words of mouth, and those sort of thing. And it's very difficult to detect. And so that is from the terrorist aspect. And economically, we are seeing the deterioration of the people's livelihood and income. The Taliban have taken charge of all of the major income streams, whether it's customs, whether it's mining sector, heavy taxation on people and businesses, and very minimal services that are being provided to the people of Afghanistan. And significantly deteriorated the international aid that is being sent, humanitarian aid from countries like India, from the US, from anywhere that are being sent in Afghanistan. They're being sent, unfortunately, in coordination with the Taliban authorities. And so they take charge of that process, and they only distribute those aid to their affiliates, to the people and communities that belong to them, and our Taliban families and the likes. The people of Afghanistan have not benefited from any of the international communities' humanitarian assistance or economic assistances. The poverty is significant and rampant, and it's getting worse by the day. The various structures of service delivery to the Afghan people, where it's water, electricity, health, is significantly deteriorating, given the fact that the Taliban government is unable to prioritize these service delivery to the people of Afghanistan. And when it was asked by the criticism that was sent to the Taliban, the acting prime minister said that this is what God wants the people of Afghanistan to deal with. I mean, this is what it is, and people need to deal with it. And regionally, we have seen that, unfortunately, given the fact that the U.S. leadership and the NATO leadership, they quickly evacuated from Afghanistan without having a proper strategy in place of what to do next, given their priorities elsewhere. The regional countries have also failed to come up with an agenda. The Chinese are primarily in the driver's seat, driving their agenda of making sure there is the Taliban consolidate their power in whatever form or shape for as long as they can, because it's very easy for them to interact with a dictatorship, with a group that does not represent the people of Afghanistan, to deal with them and to agree with them over whether it's mining rights, whether it's the associated interests that they have with the road and build projects, and other regional ambitions that they have. But other countries have only been following whether what the Chinese are doing or what the US are doing. And unfortunately, the people of Afghanistan are disappointed with how India has been performing in the past 3 years. First of all, being caught off guard with what was happening in Afghanistan, a significant regional player with significant involvement in Afghanistan in terms of development, in terms of support with the military and security sector, being caught off guard similarly, like the US and other countries, of what to do. And then since the 3 years, their engagement with the Taliban only try to make sure that no harm comes to India, has not been well received, because those threats that are being developed within the country, sooner or later it will reach India. They might have already reached India. It's very hard to establish those sort of links, increasing insecurity in different parts of India, whether they have any sort of connection with these groups. But clearly, all of the anti-Indian elements are being well received and hosted in Kabul, in Kandahar, and elsewhere. The situation is tragic. It's a tragedy that is being taken place. More than 40 million Afghans are leading uncertain lives where they do not have a legitimate government. They do not have a flag. They do not have embassies to represent them. They do not have the proper authorities to provide deliveries for them. There is no path forward for having a proper constitution in place, rule of law in place. Every commander, every group in different parts of the country are ruling based on whatever they believe is right, and their maximum extreme interpretation of Islam, which stands in contradiction to all of the things that Afghans believe, the Afghan tradition, the Islamic moderate belief that the Afghans have, and particularly 20 million Afghan women and girls who have lost all of their freedom and rights. They do not have the right to freely get out of their houses. They do not have the right to get an education. They do not have the right to work. They do not have the right to travel abroad. They do not have the right to choose their own clothing. So it's practically a gender apartheid that is going on in Afghanistan, and the international community, particularly the responsibility lies on the international community, but particularly on the region who have failed to come up with a strategy to resolve this.
I think if I might just interrupt you. Look, a lot of what you've said, one could argue with on some points with you, but by and large, it's stuff that we know what is happening. The kind of, for want of a better phrase, crimes that are being committed in the name of religion. We know that. The question, however, is there any resistance? Or are the Taliban completely in control and able to do what they want to do, and there's no pushback? So, within the Taliban movement, is there any cleavage or is there not any cleavage? Uh, is there something that can then snowball into something bigger, or is there not something like that? It's a united, consolidated movement. There might be some disagreements, but it's not a cleavage. Uh, is that the situation, or is that not the situation?
So if we look at the Taliban, imagine a mafia group. It is a decentralized structure with a centralized focus based on their interest to maintain their power. And their leadership plays an important role as a figurehead who is religiously as someone that everybody has to pledge allegiance to. So despite the fact that there are disagreements, there may be differences of views and disagreements on tactics, on a strategy, on how to achieve their objectives. But at the end of the day, that pledge of allegiance to the leadership that requires all of the members of the Taliban group to have, and if they don't have that pledge of allegiances, they are subject to any sort of treatment by the rest of the members. So if anybody raises their voices and indicate that they are no longer pledging allegiance to the leader, they can easily be killed by the rest of the extremist elements within the group. So the structure is put in place that discourages any sort of breakaway from the Taliban unless someone is or a group is particularly confident on their ability to take on the leadership. And it's very hard in this sort of movements. We have seen it in Al Qaeda and ISKP and others. It's not possible in terrorist organization to have a breakaway terrorist group or a breakaway commanders or terrorist leaders to take on the leader. It's not possible because at the end of the day, their worldview is the same. Their survival depends on the leader and the sort of a structure that they have, and that is from the Taliban. Despite that, we hear about these moderates and extremists, and it's very natural that there may be. But in terms of the practical implementation of what is useful for us, there is no hope of having any sort of a breakaway or fracture within the Taliban that would allow any sort of opening or improvement in the lives of the Afghan people or helpful for the region and international community. It's a monolithic group based on an ideology and leadership, and you can only deal with them by getting rid of all of them. There's no way that you can co-opt one or two. Unless it's an individual, they may no longer be part of the group. That's a different story, but not structurally. On the other side, the Afghan resistance, the geography of Afghanistan.
I'll come to the resistance part in a bit, because I just want to use where you've left off right now to go to Amira. Dr. Jadoon, so you have this situation, and I don't know how much you agree and what parts you disagree with, but clearly one of the threats which the Taliban themselves perceive, although they try and make light of it, but I think there does seem to be a bit of a panic within the Taliban ranks, and at least the most potent challenge to them seems to be coming from an organization which is probably even more extreme than them, the ISKP. And that's your area. So what's your sense? Is the ISKP, I believe you've written a recent piece which says that the ISKP is actually becoming a global kind of a menace. Is that actually the case? Because 3 years back, ISKP was a player, but wasn't probably that big a player. Is it growing? Is its footprint growing? Is it getting actually the support, more support now from within Afghanistan, partly as a reaction to the Taliban or as a kind of a counter to the Taliban? And then, of course, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories that the Pakistanis are backing the ISKP. Then there are some who say the Americans are backing them. The Mossad always is backing everybody. So there are all kinds of theories doing the round. I wish you could either corroborate some of these theories or debunk them, and just give us an idea of where exactly is the ISKP standing in this tussle for power and influence in Afghanistan. Dr. Jadoon.
Thank you so much. First of all, a big thanks to ORF for inviting me. It's a little bit early here, so I'll try and keep my answers coherent. And thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. So that's the million-dollar question, right? How is ISKP able to survive over almost a decade since it first emerged? And it seems to not go away despite all our efforts, multi-pronged efforts by different countries to repress this group. So I think it's critical for us to take a step back and think about militancy, not just in Afghanistan, but also in the region, because I think South and Central Asia is perhaps in some ways unique to some other parts of the world, where what happens in one country is either has spillover effects into other countries, or the underlying drivers are not just sort of constrained within one country. So overall, if we look at Afghanistan, and this is what the Taliban have been claiming and sort of celebrating, is that terrorism in the country has gone down. Now, I mean, this is sort of obvious because the Taliban took over, and previously, as Mr. Amini said, a lot of these militant groups, which are still present in Afghanistan, were connected to the Taliban insurgency, and they all still exist there. So I think we're trying to understand the state of terrorism in Afghanistan today. We have to look at the local dynamics and internal politics, which may be fueling some of this recruitment that ISKP is able to do, but also the regional dynamics, including the militant landscape more broadly. So the emergence of Islamic State, it introduced rivalries in the region, but it also created networks in the region. Part of that is what we are seeing now. We also see a sharp increase in anti-government militancy and terrorism against civilians, most generally, but prominently in Pakistan. But I think what we see today, which is most critical to understand ISKP's underlying sources of strength, is that the overall militant landscape or jihadist landscape is really fragmented. And it has different types of groups operating, which sometimes overlap in their short-term goals or their ideologies and their targets. So we have state-linked groups, right? Despite all the conspiracy theories, we do have groups which have links to certain states. We have groups which are very much sectarian, such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. Obviously, we have TTP, we have the Baloch insurgency, and then we have Al-Qaeda and Islamic State Khorasan as well. Now, I think the problem is because of these multiple militant groups in close proximity, what we're seeing is that there are personal interlinkages and organizational links between militant groups. And sometimes, because of the large informal economies across this region and porous borders, they also have links to criminal groups, which allows them to access large illegal economies. And then it allows them to, it makes the region as a whole very conducive to a wide spectrum of militant activities. So they can seek shelter, they can escape counterterrorism operations. At times, they can gain territorial control. They can continue to recruit and plan even when they are in their weakest state. So I think these networks, which formed over a 20-year period during the war on terror still continue to exist and benefit some of these groups. And again, I think what has really helped ISKP, especially since the US withdrawal and the Taliban takeover, is its intentional deeper fusion of taking its global jihadist narratives, but really, really linking them with the local narratives of all of these Central Asian countries where populations may have grievances. So obviously Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, but also Pakistan. And they're also trying to appeal to Muslims who are based in India. So I think this is highly problematic because it diversifies their recruitment pools. So they're not just relying on Afghanistan to boost their ranks and also to expand their narratives. So I think ISKP, I don't think it's as strong as it used to be during its peak years around 2018. It has declined significantly, but it has gone or become more aggressive in its efforts to gain relevance across the region, right? And we saw this immediately after the US withdrawal and the Taliban takeover. Now, even though a lot of researchers argue that ISK is constrained within Afghanistan, this shows that it's not really capable anymore. But I think we have to think more in terms of a longer time period, what we may see happening in the future, right? So I think ISK is finding itself right now in the most permissive environment due to various reasons, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think what it has really benefited from is its ability to pose as an umbrella organization. So it can sort of capture this militant market, which already existed in the region, but also especially in Afghanistan. It poses itself as a partner of choice for other militant factions, especially those which no longer can work with the Taliban insurgency for obvious reasons. And it also serves or is trying to serve as a resistance platform for all the populations which have deep grievances given the current situation in Afghanistan, but also other aggrieved populations living in surrounding regions or countries which also live under corrupt governments. So I think ISK has adapted to survive under it's within its current capacity. So it is weakened in the sense that it doesn't control territory anymore. It's not really capable of undertaking operations within Afghanistan, Pakistan to the level that they could before. So ISK's current goals have shifted accordingly. So what they're engaging now is more so in guerrilla warfare. And they're doing more targeted operations because they're following the Islamic State insurgency model, where when you're weaker, your goal becomes to inflict harm upon the enemy through rural or urban warfare. We see targeted assassinations of government and religious leaders, and we see much fewer but sophisticated attacks um, on civilians, and they have continued their attacks against Shia communities. So they're using this approach until they feel that the enemy, which is the Taliban in this case, is weakened enough where they can begin to form strongholds alongside. Now, they haven't reached that stage yet, but this is their current sort of operational model. Now, its outreach and propaganda dissemination, that also plays a critical role as a source of its underlying strength. So we have never seen levels in terms of its nuance in its narratives, the volume that is producing, the number of languages that it's using, and sort of the sophisticated narratives that it's embedding within its propaganda to appeal to a diverse, range of grievances of the populations that it targets. So we've seen obviously evidence in the form of recruitment of Tajik and Uzbeks, which extends to diaspora communities. And ISK has been encouraging either come to Afghanistan, do hijrah, or conduct external attacks or conduct attacks in your home countries. It's also trying to sort of galvanize Muslims in the West. So we know this because of its propaganda in English, which again targets grievances which populations may have in the West. Within Afghanistan, it has, again, sort of focused on targeted assassinations, targeting civilian populations in terms of Shiite minorities, but also targeting foreign actors within Afghanistan or their presence. So we've seen attacks on different embassies or Chinese personnel, again, because this way they're trying to undermine the Taliban's efforts to gain external investment, especially from the countries that Mr. Amini mentioned. And on the flip side, Al-Qaeda has been subdued. It's still present there, but it doesn't have that global reputation which Islamic State or ISK does alongside. So I think the overall environment is giving ISK new opportunities to expand. And the problem with the Taliban's counterterrorism against ISKP is that it's very much taking a heavy-handed approach. And we already know from 20 years of research and just observing what happens when states engage in counterterrorism. If you just focus on taking out maybe some prominent leaders, you do targeted leadership decapitation, this will yield short-term results. But we have seen ISK survive much worse. They have lost hundreds of leaders and thousands of militants. But their ability to recover from those losses is because they take advantage of this environment within which they're embedded, where there's already a militant pool they can recruit from. There are these populations which are aggrieved that they can recruit from. And now they're also expanding their regional and global influence through various mechanisms, which also sort of project them at times to be more powerful than they actually are, which actually can benefit its recruitment and finance, fundraising. So I think overall, ISKP is well positioned to continue to challenge the Taliban, and the Taliban CT is lacking in it that it's only engaging in leadership decapitation, perhaps, which I think the gains from that will be not sustainable, as we have seen in the past when it comes to conducting counterterrorism against ISKP. And because of its regional linkages with other groups, whether they're opportunistic militant factions or whether they're strategic collaboration, unless ISK is sort of countered by multiple governments in a coordinated manner, it will keep finding pockets where it can sort of seek refuge and then again regroup and rebuild. So, I mean, that's ISKP, but obviously there's other groups as well, including Al-Qaeda, AQIS, the Pakistani Taliban, which are also a part of the problem. And the Taliban, I'm sure, have this in their at the back of their minds at least, that there are opportunities for militants from with other affiliations to always defect to ISK because this has been ISK strategy to poach militants from other groups, including the Taliban as well.
Say that basically the Taliban are making the same mistake vis-a-vis ISKP that perhaps was made by the Americans and the Western countries in Afghanistan against the Taliban, because the strategy seemed to be the same, that you keep beating these guys and one fine day everything will be fine. You kill enough of them and you will get a victory. But you could never kill enough of them because you were never able to address the reasons which gave them this steady stream of recruits. So it seems that they seem to be making the same mistake which actually catapulted them into power. Would you go along with that, or is that a misreading of what the Taliban are trying to do?
So I think the Taliban have more limitations on their capacity than the US did. So I think I'm not sure what else we can expect from the Taliban other than just conducting short-term targeted assassinations um, or targeting populations which they suspect have linkages to ISK, which again is another problem. I think the Taliban just have limited counterterrorism capacity, especially because they have so many other governance challenges. So with at least state actors like the US or even Pakistan, they have more resources whereby they can divert some of these. Well, the US has a lot more than Pakistan, obviously. But simultaneously, you also need to take measures at the societal level, which make these societies and civilian communities more resilient to the narratives that groups like ISKP put forward. So if the Taliban are taking a very heavy-handed approach alongside, and they're also engaging in repression of civilians and women, and former Afghan government employees, then they're also inadvertently creating this pool for ISK to appeal to. But I think the Taliban, it's not that they are unwilling, perhaps they may be, but I don't think they have the skill or the capacity to see beyond kinetic measures, because what they have been is an insurgent group, which knows how to fight, limited governance. So I don't know what else we can expect from the Taliban. I know there's been a lot of talk about the Taliban are strong enough to constrain ISK, but I would really disagree with that, at least based on what we have seen.
Ambassador Jan Prasad, we've heard from Sadiq, we know, we are seeing it every day, that there seems to be a greater willingness to engage with the Taliban at one level or another. Of course, there are serious reservations on their treatment of women. In fact, many of the reservations against the Taliban have been reduced to a single point agenda. You allow women's education and then the Taliban become kosher. That's the impression I get. Please push back if you disagree. But that's the impression we get, because in all the debates that the West seems to be having, or engagements that the West seems to be having, they're plugging for this one line: allow girls education, and then all is forgiven, and then we can get back to business as usual. But it seems that countries like Russia, China, including India, people are ready to engage with the Taliban much more than they were with the previous version of Taliban. There's not much difference in their behavior, in their attitudes, in their worldview. That same remains the same. How is this whole international system working out? Is it the case that the Taliban are now perfectly acceptable commodity, or is it just you don't have an option, so what do? You just deal with them. What is it? What is happening?
The Taliban make it extremely difficult for everyone, the entire international community, to deal with them, because they haven't changed their spots. They remain pretty much the same Taliban which we saw in an earlier incarnation. However, there is a broad consensus that these are embedded in the UN Security Council resolutions. The consensus is around human rights and women's rights, counter-terrorism, Afghanistan's promise that it will not allow its territory to be used against other countries, and inclusivity in government. And there has been limited progress in all of these. No progress on the first, which is human rights and women's rights. Limited progress on combating terrorism, and no progress on inclusivity. So there is a Doha process underway, led by the United Nations. And it is significant that this time, when the Doha process third round meeting took place in Doha, the UN Secretary General, who had instigated this process last year, he himself stayed away from it. And he allowed some other senior officials to take charge. And there, in order to get the Taliban to attend, they pared down the agenda and they removed human rights and women's rights from the agenda. They also removed a formal invitation to civil society representatives and human rights activists in Afghanistan and women to come and participate, which they had done in the February meeting of the Doha process. So when the June-July meeting took place at the end of June and the 1st of July, they were not present. And that is why the Afghan government came there. When I say that there is a broad unity, there is disunity at a different level. As you yourself say, the West is primarily focused on human rights and women's rights. And of course, everyone is concerned about terrorism, whether it's the West, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, about the ETIM, or India. We don't want the arms that the Americans left behind falling into the hands of those who come into Jammu and Kashmir. So nobody talks of inclusivity in government. You asked this question first, whether there is any internal opposition to the Taliban. There is none. There is, in fact, no political or armed opposition to the Taliban today. Any threat to the Taliban comes from within the Taliban. But that, for a variety of reasons, has not happened. There was some early promise of it in the first year of Taliban rule, when the younger members of the Taliban, surprisingly, Mullah Yaqub and Siraj Haqqani, they made a pitch for relaxation on the education of girls in senior middle school and senior school and the university. And then there was a clerics conference held where they got a dressing down from the leadership. And since then, they haven't opened their mouth again. So there is a cleavage internal to the Taliban, but it's not significant. So the regional countries who are contiguous to Afghanistan were facing a problem. That what do you do with the reality of a de facto government in Kabul? So different countries deal with that situation in a different way, as compared to the European Union and the United States. The regional countries as a whole want some kind of engagement, but their position is differentiated because the Chinese, for example, have some stakes, commercial stakes in Afghanistan. They have the second largest copper mine in the world, which they bid for and got in 2007. Not a kilo of copper has so far gone to China from Anak mines. But the Taliban is now putting pressure on China to start producing and selling copper. The Chinese also have some stake in oil facilities in northern Afghanistan. The Chinese want to, a lot of small Chinese firms have come into Afghanistan. But China also has a problem with Afghanistan of terrorism because the ETIM members have been removed from the Wakhan corridor region contiguity and taken out of Badakhshan, but they have just been relocated. So the Chinese are worried that they would ideally like the Afghans to hand them over, which incidentally the previous government of Ashraf Ghani and of Hamid Karzai was doing. But this government is not doing it. And one more thing, that Chinese President Xi Jinping in January received the credentials of the new Taliban ambassador. But the flag of the Taliban Republic still flies in New Delhi on the Afghan embassy. So we haven't done that. But we have engaged and interacted with the Taliban government. We have a small mission in Kabul led by middle-level diplomats for coordinating our supplies. And we are seriously considering moving from humanitarian assistance to resuming some modicum of development assistance. And the first steps would be to complete the small development projects which were left incomplete 3 years ago, and also to maintain some of the larger Indian projects. And a step in that direction was that the new Taliban regime wanted us to go and inspect the working of the Salma Dam. So a technical team had gone and they took a look and everything seems to be working well. there.
So here is the issue, that all the countries are, for their own compulsions, ready to deal with the Taliban, but they're really not getting any comfort from them. So if you look at the Chinese, for example, like you say, that they've taken these guys out from Badakhshan and moved them somewhere else. Uh, but to my mind, I think if I was a Taliban, I would say that's a smart move, because that way at least I have some leverage over the Taliban. Now, the previous government, like good guys, gave whatever the Chinese wanted. What did get them in return, right? So the Taliban are holding some leverage, so they keep the TTP, because that gives them leverage over the Pakistanis. They keep the Ansarullah up north with the Tajiks. You keep that because it gives you leverage with the Tajiks. Uh, you keep all these kind of groups. You keep them in play. You keep them under some control. I know it's a very dangerous game. So you're not really giving comfort on the issue of terrorism. You're not giving comfort on virtually any issue. Uh, like you yourself said, the Chinese have, I don't think they've even started mining the place.
No.
I don't think there's even a drop of oil they've taken out so far from their
Yeah, but they've
investments.
placed engineers there now.
Oh, you can place engineers and make nice fancy houses for them, but nothing's coming out of the place. So I don't think the economic model is really working. So where does that then really take all these countries, which seem to be placing a lot of faith that they will be able to do business with the Taliban? And clearly, the Taliban have indicated that there's no gift from their side on virtually anything. So how does the diplomacy then work? Is it a one-way street?
No, it's the Taliban does give assurances to some countries, not to all. For example, the one country that is really disturbed by the Taliban is not India and not China, not Russia and not the United States. It's Pakistan. And 10 days before less than that, 8 days before the Doha meeting, the last one, the Pakistani PR in New York made quite a vituperative statement against the Taliban regime and said they are completely unregulated and out of bounds, and the international community must take united action against them. And why? Because Taliban are good learners. They learned from Pakistan. They got support and sustenance and shelter there. They saw how Pakistan used the Taliban as a lever with the Americans. So the Taliban now are using the TTP, as you say, as a lever against the Pakistanis. And not many people realize that Mullah Omar, before he died, in fact, at the time when he was Amirul Momineen and living in Kandahar, he had written to Musharraf saying that Afghanistan is now an Islamic Emirate and Pakistan was created on the basis of Islam, and it is time that you should think of converting Pakistan also into an emirate. So the Taliban say that what is good for Afghanistan should be equally good for Pakistan. And there Pakistan has a big problem. We are interacting with the government of, that there was one very interesting point made by Mr. Amiri about assistance going astray or assistance going into the hands of the Taliban. That is the reason why the Indian assistance that goes from here in terms of wheat, in terms of medicines, in terms of pesticides, malathion that has been supplied through Chabahar, that is distributed in Afghanistan through the World Food Program and not given directly to the Afghan authorities. And we are trying to do our best to see that some linkage with the Afghan people is maintained. But I'll come to that later if you are interested in that, about what India is doing and what it can do further to engage with the Taliban. But some contact, some engagement, some level of interaction is absolutely required for countries in the periphery of Afghanistan, because the Taliban is a reality.
Shivam, I'm sorry to come to you last, but I think the question which I have for you is on how are the people in Afghanistan surviving? So, for 20 years, there was a lot of international aid coming in, money was pouring in, all kinds of trade and other activity was there. There were international aid workers, all kinds of people who were there. So there was a lot of money sloshing around. People were, reasonably well. All that music has stopped. So there's no money flowing in. There is some trade and other stuff which is happening. But how are people on the ground surviving? I don't mean people in the rural areas who are probably living off the land anyways, but I mean people in places like Kabul, in Herat, and other places, professional people, those who haven't been able to escape. How do they survive in the conditions that exist today? What are the sources of livelihood? Uh, are the stories of hunger and starvation, how real are they, or how much of propaganda is there in those stories? What's happening on the economic scene? Because we see more investment taking place, right? Ambassador Prasad has spoken about, the Chinese investments and all of that, but frankly, there is no economic activity from mining or any of these other things. So how are people managing to survive?
Thank you so much for the question, sir. I think I would like to look at it like in two different ways. Firstly, yes, I completely agree that there is immense, like the donor fatigue has significantly increased in the past 3 years. The amount of aid that the country was receiving for the past 2 decades, it has severely fallen down. The humanitarian response plan, like the appeal for which is released every year, this time I think till last month, it has only been funded till 25% of its overall capacity, while international organizations, as like Ambassador Prasad said, WFP helps like countries like India in kind of providing like the donations that India is doing to the Afghan people. While these organizations are still there, they are also severely affected by the shortage in funding. Having talked to some like people who are working with the WFP, with the recent decision by Pakistan to kind of send Afghan refugees back to the country, that has also significantly increased the pressure on these organizations, which were already under immense strain and stress. So on that respect, the country is severely affected with no aid and with no, even like the amount of aid that they're still getting is also just meant for the short term. That is, it is mostly humanitarian aid, and there is a severe lack of like long-term or medium-term aid, which would help in the development of the country, or which would help in kind of addressing the structural issues that the country has been facing. So on that respect, yes, it is, I don't see it as propaganda in terms of like the people are genuinely suffering. The numbers have genuinely, like the number of people who are now able to get aid also, who are now able, like are beneficiaries of the aid that the country is receiving, that has also significantly fallen down. In terms of like the economic aspects, like the parameters of the economy, the GDP, so now the economy is not so as to say stagnating, but it has reached a situation where it has flatlined, like there's no, it's a stagnation sort of a situation, like it has, it's there in that state. While the Taliban, so considering like what's happening on the economic fronts, the Taliban have been able to successfully increase. So if you look at some of the numbers that come out of like the World Bank assessments or the economic monitors, the Taliban have been able to significantly increase the revenue that they've been getting, while it has still not matched the level of revenue that the country was generating when the Afghan Republic was in power, but still it has significantly increased. All those talks about corruption being reduced, that has also happened, and the country's trade with a lot of like, even though it has difficult relations with Pakistan at the moment, like its trade has consistently increased with these countries, apart from some minor hiccups every time there's some misunderstanding between these two sides. So I think the Taliban have been able to increase their revenue. They have so the picture that they portray of the economy, so there's a stark distinction between what they say and what's happening. So the picture that they portray of the economy is something that the current the economy or all of what the revenue that they're getting is domestically like sourced. So they're all relying on their own domestic, like all the revenue that they're earning is domestically sourced, even though there's very less transparency about how is it actually happening. So they give out numbers. They have these accountability programs where they kind of list out the achievements of their government. But we're still not very sure where are the numbers coming from and how much of it is actually trickling down to the people in terms of their creation of jobs or the kind of services that they're doing. On the question of what actually a common Afghan people are actually doing. So there has been, at the moment, it's only the pressure in terms of like there being some activity, it's only in the small or medium enterprises, like in some aspects through the informal transactions that happen, or it's farming, it's like the farmers have kind of been contributing to the economy. Even on the farming front with the ban on opium. So when they were there at the Doha conference this year, they listed 3 demands, and the first was that they wanted the sanctions on the banking sector to be removed. They wanted the they wanted the international community to remove like the freezing of their reserves, and the third was that they wanted the support of the international community to look for alternative livelihoods for the farmers who've been severely affected by the ban in opium cultivation. So while it has not completely like dropped in all the provinces, there's still some provinces which see opium production, and when the Taliban has tried to clamp down on production there, they have faced stiff resistance. But the number, like the percentage of opium production since 2021, it has severely come down. So in that respect also, for farmers also, it has been a difficult time. So I completely agree that the situation on the ground is really is really difficult. And the Taliban, I mean, even when you on the question of other countries are engaging with the Taliban or whatever. So the Taliban's, they've kind of taken this self-sufficient, that theirs is a self-sufficient economy also as a tool of kind of engaging with the international community. So there, if you look at their whatever press releases they have, or what the statements that they make in these accountability programs, or other like all of their posts on Twitter and everything, a major emphasis of these posts is how first they're economically self-sufficient and that they want economic relations with their partners, and that the focus of their foreign policy, so as to say, it's basically on development projects, infrastructure projects. So a lot of the tenor that we hear is that they're kind of focusing on large scale development projects. They have resumed a lot of development projects with their neighboring countries, and even inside the cities like in Kabul and in other big cities, they kind of talk about how they've kind of focused on rebuilding canals or roads. So there's a lot of talk about them investing a lot in infrastructure, investing a lot in kind of rebuilding the cities and making them, and that is how the progress is happening. But I don't see any of that kind of affecting the condition of the people in any way.
Okay, so a follow-up on this. One is an allegation made by Amrullah Saleh, where he says that the Americans have actually been funding the Taliban, even after their withdrawal. He's given some figure, I don't remember what the exact figure was. How is there any substance to that particular charge? One. Secondly, you talk about the Taliban increasing revenue. Now, where is the revenue coming from? Most of it is coming from the customs tariffs, right? Customs tariffs will only happen if there is foreign trade taking place. Foreign trade will only take place if you have foreign exchange. You have to have... Now, if you look at the Afghan currency, it's very stable, right? It hasn't fallen. It's more or less where it was 3 years back. And that's strange because it doesn't make any economic sense, right? But it's happening. So how is that taking place? Now, where is the money coming from? If the banking channels are closed, so informal channels are being used, that has to be accounted somewhere. Is there any idea where that's being accounted for, or none whatsoever?
On the first question, first I would address that. With regards to the allegations on the US money actually falling into the hands of the Taliban, that has been since 2021, when first majority of the aid suddenly stopped, and then there emerged a discussion as to now what do we do? Like, we can't completely abandon the Afghan people. So there emerged a consensus in the international community to kind of ensure that they would give aid in whatever terms, but in a way, but make efforts to gatekeep it from, like, falling into the hands of the Taliban. So that has happened. For example, like the foreign reserves of Afghanistan, while it's embroiled like in a completely different case in the US, there's a certain half of it, like 3.5 million USD, I think, is being separately kept like in a trust fund, while it's still like, the success of that trust fund and kind of actually that money flowing to the country, that's a completely different issue. But the idea was to have like some sort of a fencing in terms of not letting, like, giving them money, but ensuring that none of that money falls into the hands of Taliban officials. So even in their central bank, some suggestions as to how we can go ahead thinking of, how to unfreeze the reserves. One idea was to kind of have certain officials in place who are not associated with the Taliban, and then they could kind of be the facilitator for like aid dispersion. But this is something that the Taliban is against. So this debate has always been there. These concerns have always existed. Since I think 2022, there were increasing reports about the Taliban actually kind of diverting aid to the provinces or to the places where they want, like, kind of favoring the provinces where they wanted the aid to go. They have intercepted some of the aid, like for WFP and a lot of other organizations. There have been instances of them intercepting some of the aid and everything. So I don't completely deny that possibility. In terms of this specific instance of, so the US has been one of the reasons, and that also feeds into the second question that you asked a little. So one of the reasons, like one main source of cash flow inside the country is like the US cash handouts it has been giving after the fall of Kabul. So that the cash handouts that it's been giving to the country. So I think that I think there was a recent report which said that there are some instances of the Taliban actually, it's actually going into their hands. And I think I don't see that as a completely baseless allegation. In terms of now, 3 years in power, I think the Taliban is in a much better space in terms of, like, they've solidified their control over the country. So completely ruling out the fact that some of that, I'm not saying that a lot, everything that was given to them for the people of Afghanistan in the past 3 years has fallen into the hands of the Taliban. But yes, I don't deny the possibility that some amount of that must have definitely happened, and that's, I think, inevitable considering the situation that the country is in. So I don't completely rule out the possibility that has happened. On the question of the second question that you asked about where is the money coming from? So yes, it's like basically it's custom. So when after coming to power, one of the first like steps that they did in terms of consolidating their control over the country was like they kind of broke down the existing patronage networks that within like their movement, and they established like a lot of these border checkpoints inside the country as well, where they started collecting the revenues. That is considered a major source of where they're getting the money from, but still there's a lot of opaqueness about how much money and what is it happening. So for example, they recently released their latest budget in May of this year. While they've mentioned the amount and like the amount that they've earmarked for the next year, there's still no classification of where it like the source and what will it be actually earmarked, what is it actually earmarked for, what will it be used for. So that opaqueness is still there, but I think the major source of the income, like the revenue that they've been generating, is like the border checkpoints that they've established. And because they've been able to dismantle the patronage networks that were there, not that there are reports of certain senior Taliban officials still being able to kind of reroute revenue to their own networks. There were some reports about Sirajuddin Haqqani rerouting some of the revenues that they were collecting from some provinces, but still more or less they've been able to dismantle the existing patronage networks and kind of keep it in a centralized coffer, which is the major source of the revenue that they've.
I wanted to ask you about the issue of the TTP, which is now looming very large. The scale of attacks that they've been launching, the kind of the scale of geography in which they've been launching the attacks, and the ferocity of the attacks, number one. Number two, the fact that despite multiple attempts by Pakistan to reach out to the Taliban, there isn't much comfort coming the Pakistan way. Now, what is behind the support for the TTP? Is it it's the same fraternity? Is it that? Is it leverage over Pakistan? Is it part of a larger, grander kind of a emirate which the Taliban want to extend? Is it the fear that uh, if you alienate the TTP, you strengthen the ISKP? All of these things, I'm sure you've heard all of this earlier, and I'm sure there's some elements of all of this. But what is your take on what is propelling the TTP and making it such a big thing? Because it seems that they've started virtually following the Taliban model in Pakistan, whether it's on the extortion thing, whether it's setting up shadow governors, whether it is ruling the streets in the night, the letters, all kinds of things. Everything which the Taliban did over 20 years, the TTP is doing now, and the Pakistani government seems to be at sea. Where do you think this is leading up to?
Great question. So first of all, I think Pakistan was not expecting this from the Afghan Taliban in terms of taking this sort of relaxed stance towards the TTP. However, I don't think it was surprising because for several years, there had been a lot of anti-Pakistan sentiment growing amongst the Taliban ranks. And there have been instances where the Pakistani military hasn't treated many Taliban leaders very well. And, frankly speaking, it was playing a double game while being a partner in the war on terror, but still maintaining links with the Afghan Taliban. Now, the Afghan Taliban have been actually slowly distancing themselves from Pakistan's influence and control since before the US withdrawal and the Taliban's takeover. So I think the Taliban were already sort of headed this way. And then the TTP, of course, is very much taking a page out of the Taliban's playbook. They were, I think, the first militant group to celebrate the Taliban's takeover. They renewed their pledge to Akhundzada, and it's become very obvious that the Afghan Taliban have no interest in repressing or suppressing the TTP for the sake of Pakistan, because of the main obvious reason is that they don't need a safe refuge across the border anymore. And there is a lot of built up resentment amongst the ranks of the Taliban. And so I think we cannot deny that there's a lot of ideological affinity. There have been intermarriages. They share ethnic linkages, which really run deep when you look at the Pashtun belt across the Duran line, right? And some Afghan Taliban foot soldiers have now also declared that the fight against the Pakistani forces will be the next phase of their jihad. And from a strategic perspective, there's really no incentive for the Afghan Taliban to crack down on the TTP for the various elements that you mentioned, is because there have been their brothers in arms. Targeting the TTP is going to create a lot of other problems, such as defections to other groups. So TTP factions in prior years did defect entire factions to ISK. So again, it doesn't make sense from the Taliban's perspective or rational calculations to actually start fighting the TTP. Now, on the flip side, the TTP, they've benefited organizationally from a number of things. So first of all, they benefited from the release of hundreds of TTP members from prisons across Kabul, who had been imprisoned by US forces and the former Afghan government. Now, since between 2020 and 2024, the TTP, I think it's up to over 50 mergers. So they have really been focused on rebuilding their strength and sort of countering the problems that they encountered in previous decades. which resulted in a lot of internal fighting, splintering of groups. So they have really made a concerted effort to bring back all of these factions. And they have also formed alliances with Baloch militant groups. They have, their current leader has really sought to improve the image of the TTP. So they are steering away from targeting civilians as they did in the past, which really harmed them. You look at their media operations, these have also been centralized and they've become more sophisticated. And at the same time, while they're organizationally gaining all this strength, they also know that Pakistan, economically, sociopolitically, is having a lot of challenges. And within their narratives and their outreach, you can see that they're exploiting some of these issues. For example, when protesters came out for Imran Khan, the TTP was encouraging them, right? Because their enemy is the Pakistani army primarily. So I think, yes, the Afghan Taliban have no incentives rationally to target the TTP. The TTP have been inspired by the Taliban's playbook, and they are absolutely following that. They think that they are in a position of strength compared to the Pakistani government and army. And I think organizationally, they have not been stronger than they are right now. So they actually think that they have a real chance to use violence to really, if they want to bring the Pakistani government back to the negotiating table, to agree to their terms. So negotiations will only be fruitful if both parties are at that point where they think violence is not going to yield any more utility. The Pakistani government may be at that point, but the TTP think they can get a better deal, so they're going to continue their fight. And we're seeing sort of the outcomes associated with all these mergers, a more coherent organization, an organization which is claiming that their fight is only with the state and not with civilians. They're trying to win some broader societal support. They're engaging in more sophisticated media operations. So this doesn't look like good news at all for Pakistan from my perspective. It's a big issue.
If I can just turn to you for the last question, give us an idea. We understand that, okay, there is a lot of anger against the Taliban, but there is no resistance. All the people who were supposed to provide any kind of resistance are either holidaying in Europe or partying in Turkey. The people fighting inside Afghanistan, there are two groups. Yes, we agree. But that's like virtually zero resistance, right? It doesn't really affect the Taliban regime. The international community is not ready to fund any kind of a resistance to Taliban. I think there's a lot of fatigue with the war in Afghanistan. Everybody wants to forget, at least in the West, that Afghanistan exists. It does, very much so. Will be a problem later on, but then I don't think anybody has that time perspective. As an Afghan, what in your view is there to resist the Taliban today? There is no organized movement. There is no organized force, really. Most of the old figures are too old, too compromised, too lazy. So what does that mean that this is it for the people in Afghanistan?
I don't think this is it for the Afghan people. I think what is happening in Afghanistan is beyond the scope of what is happening inside the country. We're trying to evaluate internally of various ways of looking at the Taliban. But before getting into the resistance and what would look like for the future, a few points that was made by the panelists. First of all, I don't think the Taliban has the willingness to take on the ISKP, because ideologically and as a group, operationally, it served them from the time that they came up being present in that geography. It made the Taliban to be of a lesser evil in the eyes of the region and in the eyes of the international community, particularly the region when they saw ISKP and how they were beheading people and putting people on bombs and exploding and killing people, that they thought, then how would we deal with it? And the Taliban portrayed themselves as a group that they could take on, and the region bought into that narrative. I think it's a very an active effort of a good cop, bad cop policy that the fundamentalists and extremists are playing with the region and international community, with one arm being ISIS-K and another arm being the Taliban. As we know, all of the ISIS-K are former Taliban members who defected from the Taliban, and they are part of the ISIS-K right now. And we have noticed also since the emergence, since the takeover of the Taliban, the ISIS-K has become much more stronger in their operational capabilities and its strength, internally as well as externally. And all the actions that the Taliban are taking inside the country, indicating that they're going after the ISIS-K. These are the Tajik boys who are part of the resistance, and they're being branded as ISIS-K, while the real ISIS-K fighters and commanders are living comfortably in Kandahar, in Kabul, and elsewhere under the protection of the Haqqanis, and they are much more focused on conducting operations outside of Afghanistan in all of the countries, and the primary objective is to make themselves more of a relevant actor in terms of counterterrorism for all of these countries who are scared and fearful of what's going to happen to them with ISIS-K being stronger. That's the first point. The second point that was made in terms of, so you mentioned that the Taliban are doing, it's a smart game that they're not giving to the Chinese, they're not giving to the Iranians, they're not giving to the Indians. It's not a game. It's aligned with their philosophy that why would they give up their brothers in arms who, with their actions, with their efforts, they're doing basically what the Taliban were supposed to be doing. And this time around, they're not focused on what they're doing. They're not going to focus on kidnapping or hijacking planes or going after Indian interests. They're going to focus on winning over Indians, to be on the same table, while at the same time their brothers and some we're gonna hit you from the back, and they're gonna hit you. Be mindful of that. And if anybody thinks that what's happening in Pakistan is not going to happen to India, or it's not going to happen to China or Russia or the US or Europe, I think we're looking at it blindly, and we're thinking that terrorism, we're not taking it very seriously. I think, given the fact that there's great game competition between different countries and who's having more influence, who's having more contacts, and the Taliban have realized this, and they've realized how the regional countries are basically a bunch of hypocrites who do not actually represent the interests of their people in the long term. In the short term, it's some bureaucrats, it's some security officers who are only looking into just taking a check mark of how much engagement they're having with the Taliban compared to Pakistan, compared to China, or compared to US, or compared to Europe. And this competition, a tug of competition between diplomats and security folks at the tactical level, are going to hurt the nations in general, because these maneuvering by different countries is basically allowing the Taliban to have an upper hand. It's basically allowing all of the terrorist organizations and groups to have an upper hand. And I look at the lens of the TTP. I mean, I understand what's happening between Pakistan and the TTP, but at the same time, Pakistan is also in need of assistance from the international community, and the assistance was coming to them in terms of various benefits that they were getting from the US and coalition forces being in Afghanistan. But right now, I mean, recently their army officer and ISI chief was in Washington, D.C., seeking assistance in counterterrorism to fight against TTP. So how much the Taliban, the Pakistanis, are actually letting the TTP to be perceived as a major threat, or their problem with the Taliban to be perceived as a major threat, is a question that is an open question. And in terms of coming back to the real question of the political opposition, there is an active political opposition against the Taliban. All of the more than 20 million Afghan women and girls are against the Taliban. And Afghan refugees, more than 8 million Afghans are against the Taliban. What we are looking at it is organizationally or structurally, maybe there is no institutions in place that would actively take on the Taliban politically, and that is because there is no feasible ground for the opposition, for the Taliban to emerge. None of the countries in the neighborhood are encouraging or even allowing the Taliban opposition to emerge. They're not giving visas to the Afghans. They're not allowing them to gather. You mentioned, all of the old elite. Of course, they've lost their credibility and reputation. That's a fact. But the younger generation, where they could come up, the only country that is allowing some sort of a support for the resistance is Tajikistan. And even with Tajikistan, the Taliban have reached out. They've reached out through the Russians, and they're trying to restrict the maneuverability of the resistance in Tajikistan. So where are they gonna get their arms? Where are they gonna get the money? And the geography is such that without the foreign assistance, without the financial support, without the ammunition, without the weapons, there's no way that the Afghan people are going to stand up against the group and fight with empty hands. The women of Afghanistan did it, but they're not gonna succeed while they're seeing all of these diplomats and dignitaries and all of these countries putting a red carpet in front of the Taliban, having an extremist group which is dedicated in crushing and killing anybody who stands against their rule, and a minority group, an extremist group that does not represent the interests of this country, being treated as if they are the representative or they're the natural power right now in Afghanistan by all the regional countries and international communities. Basically a betrayal of the Afghans. The Afghans look at it and they see a betrayal by the region and by the international community that a group that does not represent them, a group that is a terrorist organization, a group that is keen on taking on behalf of Afghanistan, facilitating all of these terrorist groups to go after all of the region and international community, being treated as a reality is a sort of betrayal. And particularly, I mean, among all the countries, they may have all of their different motivations, but you indicated the music has stopped in Afghanistan. The music has literally stopped, and a country like India that is basically known for its music, known for its Bollywood, the Taliban group is a group that is basically against all of that, and then seeing Indians engaging with the Taliban is really an embarrassment. It's really makes the Afghans sad to see this.
Let me take that to Ambassador Jayant Prasad. So you've been indicted as the diplomats and bureaucrats who've been ticking the check boxes on engagement, and Sadiq has made some very serious charges against India. Some I agree with, but a lot I also understand that we have our own compulsions, whether we like it or not. What do we do? When we counseled certain things to the great powers, nobody was listening to us then, but now everybody expects us to do many things, which geography probably does not allow us to do, but I don't want to take that question. I'll throw it at you because diplomats are the best people to answer such questions.
First, thanks for the question and the googlies with it. I want to go back very, very briefly to your previous question about the internal situation concerning terrorism, which is of great interest to India. I agree with Sadiq Amiri that sooner or later, any instability in Afghanistan is going to affect India adversely, as much as Pakistan or China or Russia or the rest of the international community. But the threat of Al-Qaeda and the ISKP, I very much liked Amira's analysis. It's a real threat, but a waning threat. The threat is not the same level that we saw a little bit earlier. And the biggest symptom of that is that the targets chosen by the ISKP are soft targets now. They are not hard targets. They are not military command posts or army personnel. They go and attack civilians in theaters, they go and attack a Sikh Gurdwara in Kabul. They go and attack minorities like Shias and Hazaras. So it's a sign of weakness rather than strength. And the second thing I want to say, which nobody has mentioned, that in dealing with terrorism earlier, it is not that the Americans could not have knocked out the Taliban leadership, sometimes all in one go, because the fact that the drones were following the Taliban leaders who were congregating for their Shura meetings in Quetta and in Miramshah, or sometimes even in Karachi, it is not that they were unaware of that. They had ground intelligence. They were able to see the people congregating, but they took a conscious decision that the kind of taking out of the leadership of ISKP and even for that matter of TTP and of Al-Qaeda whether it's Ayman al-Zawahiri or whether it's Osama bin Laden, the Taliban leadership were never targeted in that manner. Lesser Taliban leaders, field commanders, regional leaders, they were targeted, but not the main leaders, not the members of the Taliban Shura. So, so far as India is concerned, let me assure you that our engagement is a highly calibrated one. In fact, I am very unhappy with the type of engagement that we have, because there are, firstly, the good news is that we are moving from humanitarian assistance to development assistance, in the sense that we are not going to give anything new, but we are going to maintain what we have done before, and we are going to complete the incomplete projects. The second thing is scholarships for Afghan youth. Now, because of the problems that we have of determining who is an Afghan national and who is a Pakistani national, Shivam, I'm glad you spoke about the return of the Afghan refugees from Pakistan. In the first phase, which has been completed, 600,000 returned. In the second phase, which has just started, 800,000 are to return, which means 1.5 million Afghans are going to go back to Afghanistan, putting an enormous pressure on its government and the rest of Afghan society, which is already in a very penury-stricken state. So I have a feeling that what we are doing is certainly not enough. We are doing something really small. All the humanitarian, the wheat supplies, the malathion supplies, the supplies of 300 tons of medicine, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what Afghanistan needs. We have not been able to resume our scholarship scheme, although online, the ITech program and the scholarship scheme has been functioning since last year. So there are 1,000 Afghans, including 300 women, who are not allowed to study in Afghan universities. They are enrolled in 20 Indian universities. And this year, I am making an advocacy that we should increase this proportion from 30% of the scholarships to 50%, that we should give scholarships to 500 Afghan girls who are studying in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, because of the visa issue, we are not able to allow fresh Afghan students to come into India. And that policy also needs to be revisited, to my mind, because we pride ourselves in people-to-people relations with Afghans. Our relationship with Afghanistan has never been with either the regime of Hamid Karzai or the regime of Ashraf Ghani. It was oriented to benefit the Afghan people. But the only people-to-people contact that we have today is really in the arena of cricket, because the Afghan cricket home ground is in Noida, and they play international matches also in Noida. And the Afghan cricket team flies the Republic's flag, not the Taliban flag. It is accepted by the Taliban government. And when the T20 team of Afghanistan did so well, the Taliban government was as happy as the Afghan people were. So that's a good sign. Finally, what we have to do is we have to liberalize the entry of Afghans in need of medical assistance. People who have undergone chemotherapy here and want to come for a follow-up and so on. Even that has not been allowed so far. And I think in case we want to revive and maintain our contact with Afghanistan, much more than dealing with the Taliban government, this connection has to be revived.
I've already overshot the time, but I will take 10-15 minutes for a Q&A because people have made the effort to come out here. So the floor is open. Please identify yourself. Please identify the person you want to ask the question to, and please be brief. I don't think anybody's interested in commentary right now. If you have any questions, stick to that. So yeah, the floor is open.
Sumir Basin, to Ambassador Prasad, and to our speakers here. Why are we not getting out of, where is the real power of Afghanistan lie? And my question to the speakers, is it in the Pashtun tribes or is it with the Taliban Shura? And what is that balance of power?
Good evening. My question is to Madam Amira. You mentioned about, in fact, TTP Pakistan being an important player. The most important thing about TTP Pakistan is in fact, border fencing issue which Pakistan was handling, and in fact doing the border fencing, where in fact there was a resistance from the Afghanistan Talibans. So what is your thought on that? And how it plays an important role in the Pakhtunistan issue of, in fact, major issue, Pakistan.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my question is for Ambassador, sir. Sir, as economic conundrum rises in Afghanistan, can we expect the ruling dispensation in Afghanistan to succumb to the economic pressure and change their cultural stance as far as women's rights are concerned? A small second fold question, sir. This is related to the Indian foreign policy. Can we expect a change in the Indian foreign policy as as change of guards happen in the times to come in the central government? Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question to the panel is, my name is Vinayak. I'm from South Asian University studying Masters in International Relations. The Taliban have been claiming that they have been providing democratic mechanisms in their style, such as provincial councils comprising of clerics and tribal leaders. Are these working efficiently? If the Taliban make this work efficiently and liberalize the Islamic law interpretation, can this lead to improved security environment and can improve economic outlook? Thank you.
A very good evening to one and all present here. I am Anushka Thapliyal. I am currently pursuing BA Honours third year in political science. So my question to Ambassador Sir is that what are the 3 key learnings we can have from Afghanistan and the issue of Taliban currently, and what are your takes on UN 1951 Convention of Refugee Law that is basically being provoked by Pakistan currently, because they are not following the convention and they are sending people in a state of war again. So what are your remarks on that? Thank you.
Okay, so let me just finish this first round. So Amira, there are, I think, a couple of questions to you. One is on who is important, tribes or Taliban. The other one was on fencing. And I think there was a third one on, I think there were these two. So please, Amira, if you could answer these two, please.
Sure. So I'll take the first one regarding where does the power lie? So in terms of ethnicities on a larger scale, yes, the Pashtun tribes dominate, per my understanding, and they're also the largest ethnic group. However, I think that the actual power, political power right now is pretty clear that it lies with the Taliban. But I think what we have sort of seen, and I'd be curious to see what Sadiq says, his thoughts on this. But I think Akhundza has been slowly consolidating and centralizing power, and actually in some ways reducing the decision-making power of the Shura, which has generally been the norm. So I think power within the Taliban is becoming more concentrated for more coherent and cleaner decision-making, and maybe to sort of navigate some of the disagreements which emerged in the initial years immediately after the Taliban's takeover. Regarding the fencing, border fencing issue, it's such a long 1,600 plus mile border, which is very porous. And just the idea of physically fencing that never really seemed feasible to me personally. There's still hundreds of, crossings over this border. And I think what the bigger issue or the underlying issue is that the Duran line is disputed by the Taliban or Pashtun tribes on either side. And it's seen as a legacy of the British. So it's not actually even acknowledged or accepted as the official border between the two countries. So without actually resolving that underlying historical issue, fencing is obviously just going to create more tensions between the two countries. And I also think it's just not feasible in the long term. How practical is it to completely seal a border which is so long and it's porous? As we know, there's still plenty of movement across the borders. So I think that the issue about the Duran line as a border between the two countries needs to be resolved because it's not accepted by Afghanistan.
Sadiq, do you want to come in on any of these issues?
Sure. In terms of an uprising in Afghanistan or a resistance, I think we should look into a national uprising. I think that's the only solution or an option left for the people of Afghanistan, and actively the youth leaders are working on this. Sooner or later, there will be an uprising against the Taliban from within Afghanistan, supported by the Afghan refugees from abroad. Second, I would like to recommend that you look into the security and political leadership establishment or those entities and offices that are in charge of engagement with the Taliban or Afghanistan, because they have been failing you previously. They failed to detect the Taliban takeover, and they're right now failing to detect the threats that are being developed within the country. And one instance that I would like to indicate is that right now what's happening is the Taliban engagement with India or all of these democratic countries is basically creating anti-Indian resentment in Afghanistan. And I would like to just point out that you wouldn't want to end up a situation like Bangladesh when the Taliban are taken down, that anti-Indian resentment are going to be in full display. Just wanted to indicate that. And of course, and I agree with Amira that Akhundzada is right now in charge of the whole power. And who knows who is Akhundzada and where he's reporting, because he's a ghost. And all of the people who are interacting with the Taliban are basically interacting with entities and offices and leaders who are reporting to a ghost. At some point, we're going to see where that tail is tied and how they're going to bite all of the countries that are engaging the Taliban. Thank you.
Mr. Bhasin's question is unanswerable. So I will desist from it because we don't have enough time for that.
Which is why I was not letting him ask the question in the first place.
I'll answer the last question first. That was asked by Ms. Thapalyal at the back. You know, the UN Refugee Convention of 51 was supplemented by the 67 Refugee Protocol. And India is not a signatory of either, so neither is Pakistan. And a lot of people in Europe, for example, who have signed that convention no longer respect it, because that convention says that if there is a person who has a fear of persecution and fear for his life, if he seeks refuge or asylum, you have to consider it. But because earlier, when the convention was made in 51, there was a divide in Europe between the East and the West. And those who came from behind the Iron Curtain, from the communist countries, they were embraced with open arms in the West. And therefore, anybody who said he had a fear of persecution or a threat to life was given asylum or shelter. But now the asylum seekers are Afghans, Somalis, Pakistanis, Indians, Chinese. So these are people with different hues and colors. They are not Caucasian, they are not European. So these countries are now shutting down their borders and not respecting the Convention of 51, to which they were party, but India was never a party. So the question of India accepting those guidelines doesn't exist. We take our decisions on a case-by-case basis, depending on the actual situation that prevails on our borders. About the three takeaways, there is a three-sentence reply there, because the one lesson is that don't feed snakes because they can come back and bite you. The second is that military power alone doesn't give you the right answers out of all problems that you confront as a nation. And the third is that vis-a-vis Afghanistan, any country that wants stability and progress in Afghanistan must stay the course for the long term and must have what the Annals group of historians call the longue durée. Without that, of course, you can't do anything. So we don't have to look at the contingent present situation, but have to look ahead and see how to do things. On your question there about whether the need for assistance, the need for resources to be released of the Afghan central bank, which are in the custody of Western financial institutions, or whether the threat of sanctions, they are enough to move the Taliban to change their policies internally. I think the change will come about, but very, very, very slowly and very gradually. And don't expect any miracles from it.
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Hirokjyoti Kalita. I'm doing masters at South Asian University in International Relations. So my question is to Ambassador Sir. Sir, in a country as tribally and as ethnically diverse as Afghanistan, how is the Taliban regime, how is the current regime managing the internal dissent among the different ethnic groups, particularly in the region like Panjshir Valley, where opposition has been historically strong? Because you have already said that the threat to Taliban is within Taliban. So how the Taliban regime is managing the internal dissent?
So, hi, my name is Christy, and I'm currently awaiting admission in universities, and I think I might be the youngest here. So, my question is to the panelists regarding that. I read an article by the ORF as well that mentioned about NRF, the National Resistance Fund, and although Sir mentioned about it that or mainly all the resistance leaders might be on holiday or partying in Western countries, the article mentioned about intensive fighting and insurgency through a two-stage method. Is it the same situation as the other resistance funds, or
Was for the author of that particular article, so I'll pass it on to her. And there's a third question. I don't know if I shortlisted anybody. Go ahead. This is the last one. So,
yes. Good evening. It's been 7 days, just a week, that US made its first transaction since Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, and it accidentally, what US says, accidental transaction of $230 million to the Taliban. So is it going to be, do you have any hope, or are you still pessimistic about the transfer of the money in the hands of Taliban? Thank you.
The fact is, brother, that any money that is being sent to Afghanistan, it's being sent to the Taliban authorities. Of course, there is a bank, Afghanistan International Bank, that is it's seemingly independent, but all of the bank accounts of Afghans who are abroad are blocked. Nobody has access to them, against all the international rules, against all the established norms. So it is being controlled by the Taliban. All of their officials are right now in charge of the bank. So the money goes to that bank, and from that bank, they disperse Afghani. So all of the international community, different organizations, anybody that is present or involved in any sort of humanitarian development, the ambassador mentioned that the support or the wheat is given to WFP. All of these organizations, they cannot operate in Afghanistan without the approval of the Taliban. All of their employees are dictated by the Taliban. All of the contracting companies, organizations, NGOs, that are operating and working with these international organizations, all of them are the ones that have been recently established since 2021 when the Taliban took charge. And these are the ones that are only allowed to work with these international organizations. And all of the NGOs that have been active in Afghanistan before 2021 have been closed down. They're no longer allowed to operate. So basically, it's a state structure that has been controlled by a group that is the Taliban. It's a terrorist group, a terrorist organization, because within this terrorist group, they have up and they're part of the state structure. So it is a terrorist state, and they control all of the state machinery. They control all of the humanitarian aspects. So any money that goes to Afghanistan in the name of Afghans, it goes to the pockets of the Taliban or their affiliates, families, and supporters and financiers.
Thank you for your question. The piece that you were referring to, I think I wrote it more than a year back. And yes.
That's your defense.
So I do talk about this piece specifically talks about the number of the increasing number of attacks by the NRF and the Afghanistan Freedom Front and certain other groups, and the strategy that I mentioned, that which is a stated strategy, which they themselves stated, that their approach was to kind of first go with targeted attacks on Taliban officials, and then kind of use whatever political whatever leverage they can through that to kind of then progress on the political front, in the country. But almost a year more than a year later, I think while there have been one-off attacks, there are also recently reports about the NRF and the Afghanistan Freedom Front kind of coordinating some attacks in certain provinces. And there have been some reports about, while it's not established that these were something that the Taliban did, but some reports about kind of on social media, some accounts kind of trying to create a rift between the NRF and the Afghanistan Freedom Front to kind of, create differences, which kind of indicates that the fact that it's happening means that they might pose some threat to the Taliban. But I think at this very moment, as was discussed by Mr. Amini as well and the other panelists, the resistance is severely weakened because they have no international support, and because they're themselves also logistically and operationally, they do not have the capacity that they did back during the first regime of the Taliban. So I think on that respect, it's still their condition at the moment is still very weak, and I do not see them kind of strengthening, them being able to kind of increase their strength in the near future, unless, there's some sort of international support, which seems to be.
Shivam, that was a good reply, because on the NRF, in the beginning, the resistance was short and quite violent, but they got defeated. They got defeated for a variety of reasons, because the Pakistanis were giving full support in terms of military advice, in terms of ammunition and supplies, in terms of logistics, but also basically there was an imbalance in the forces between the two sides. So a lot of leaders who were close to the NRF did not come to NRF support at that time in Panjshir, because they thought that that assistance would be futile at that stage. And this ties up very well with your question about multi-ethnicity in Afghanistan and the impact of the non-inclusion of communities in governing Afghanistan. And my own view is, of course, nothing is visible right now in material terms. But if large segments of the Afghan people are deprived of authority and deprived of any political power, then sooner or later there will be resistance. And they are bound to come together. When it will happen, how it will happen, one doesn't know. And by the way, you talked about the dominance of one community, the Pashtuns, over all the other communities. But this is not new in Afghanistan. Pashtuns are a minority in Afghanistan. And there have been two democratic presidents in Afghanistan in the last 20 years of the non-Taliban rule, Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. And they won a number of elections. But those elections were decided not by how Afghans voted, but how the votes were counted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jan Prasad. Thanks a lot, Dr. Amira Jadoon and Sadek Amini, and thanks a lot to Shivam, who's put this whole thing together. It's been a fabulous, interventions by the panelists, and there's a lot of takeaways from this particular thing. I'll certainly request you, Dr. Jadoon and Sadek, we'll have you again on a number of panels. So look forward to having you with us again, perhaps in person someday. And thanks a lot, Ambassador Prasad and Shivam, and thank you everyone who was out here for this particular discussion. Thank you. Goodbye.